In a landmark and closely watched decision, the Supreme Court has struck down President Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose sweeping global tariffs. The justices ruled that the administration's actions exceeded the authority granted by Congress, and that the president's broad interpretation of emergency powers was not justified under the law. Declaring the tariffs an unconstitutional overreach, the court emphasized the importance of checks and balances in the American system of government. The ruling effectively dismantles the tariff wall that had come to define Trump's aggressive trade policy, which targeted imports from dozens of countries and sparked global trade tensions. By reasserting congressional authority over international commerce, the decision restores a key constitutional principle and limits the executive branch's ability to act unilaterally on trade. This marks the end of an era of aggressive, unilateral trade actions and signals a dramatic shift in U.S. economic strategy. Markets and businesses are now bracing for a new phase of trade policy, one that will likely require more negotiation and cooperation with Congress. American businesses, many of which have paid billions in tariffs over the past several years, now anticipate massive refunds and a potential boost to their bottom lines. However, the ruling also injects significant uncertainty into supply chains and budget planning, as companies scramble to adjust to the new legal landscape. The decision's impact is already being felt in boardrooms and shipping yards across the country. Globally, the decision casts doubt on trade agreements forged under the threat of tariffs, and forces the current administration to rethink its approach to international negotiations and economic alliances. With this ruling, the Supreme Court has redrawn the boundaries of presidential power, sending a clear message about the limits of executive authority. The decision has ignited a national debate over the roles of Congress and the executive in shaping America's place in the global economy, and its ripple effects are likely to be felt for years to come. President Trump's tariff strategy took an unexpected turn when he relied on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. This law, passed in 1977, was originally designed to give the president authority to respond to extraordinary threats to national security, such as terrorism or hostile foreign powers, not to reshape the nation's economic policy or wage a trade war. By declaring a national trade emergency, the administration was able to impose sweeping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of imports. This maneuver allowed the White House to bypass Congress and sidestep the usual checks and balances that govern trade policy, using executive power in a way rarely seen before. The result was staggering. The tariffs generated more than $165 billion in revenue in just 1 year, a sum that quickly became a cornerstone of the administration's fiscal agenda. This windfall was used to offset losses from the trade war and fund relief for affected industries, making tariffs not just a negotiating tool, but a major source of government income. However, critics from both sides of the aisle argued that IEEPA was never meant to be used for broad economic protectionism. They pointed out that the emergency, cited by the administration, did not fit the law's original intent, raising concerns about executive overreach and the erosion of legislative authority. Legal challenges soon followed. Lawsuits argued that the Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the exclusive power to tax and regulate trade. The courts were asked to decide whether the president had exceeded his authority by invoking IEEPA for economic rather than security reasons. The administration's bold and aggressive use of IEEPA set the stage for a high-stakes constitutional battle. At its core was a fundamental question: how far can a president go in using emergency powers to shape the nation's economy? The stakes were enormous, not just for the future of American trade, but for the very balance of power between Congress and the executive branch and the limits of presidential authority in times of crisis. The legal battle began in lower courts, where the first challenges to the administration's sweeping tariffs were filed. These cases were brought by a coalition of American businesses, importers, and trade associations, all of whom argued that the tariffs were not only economically damaging, but also violated established legal procedures. In courtrooms across the country, business owners and their legal teams presented evidence showing how the tariffs disrupted supply chains, increased costs, and threatened jobs. They contended that the administration had overstepped its authority by invoking emergency powers in a way Congress never intended. Federal courts consistently ruled against the administration, finding that IEEPA was misused to bypass established trade laws. Judges emphasized that the law was designed for true emergencies, not as a blanket justification for broad economic measures. The Court of International Trade and the Federal Circuit both affirmed that Congress never intended IEEPA as a tool for broad tariff policy. Their decisions underscored the importance of maintaining the separation of powers and respecting the legislative process. The Federal Circuit's majority warned that such a reading would give the president unchecked power to tax imports, authority reserved for Congress. They cautioned that allowing this precedent could fundamentally alter the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. Despite repeated defeats, the administration pressed on, relying on dissenting opinions that favored expansive presidential power. White House lawyers argued that national security concerns justified extraordinary measures, even in the face of judicial skepticism. President Trump demanded Supreme Court review, warning of economic disaster if the tariffs were struck down. He insisted that the executive branch needed flexibility to respond to global threats and protect American industries. The stage was set for a final, decisive Supreme Court ruling, a moment that would determine not only the fate of the tariffs, but also the limits of presidential power in shaping U.S. trade policy for years to come. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision by Chief Justice Roberts, firmly checked presidential authority under IEEPA. The majority held that only Congress can impose broad, revenue-generating tariffs, reaffirming the separation of powers. The court clarified that IEEPA's emergency powers are for targeted threats, not general trade dissatisfaction. The ruling drew support from both conservative and liberal justices, emphasizing constitutional principle over politics. Dissenters argued for deference to the president in emergencies, but the majority saw the tariff regime as a profound legislative encroachment. The decision re-established clear limits on executive power in trade and taxation. The ruling triggers a massive financial upheaval. The government must refund up to $150 billion in tariffs to American businesses. This windfall for companies comes at the cost of a huge budget shortfall, as future tariff revenue, once projected at $400 billion annually, vanishes. The administration now faces tough choices: find new revenue, cut spending, or negotiate with Congress. For businesses, refunds offer relief, but can't undo years of supply chain disruption and lost market share. Processing claims will be a logistical challenge, and the fiscal uncertainty could shake markets. The decision exposes the immense economic power wielded through IEEPA and the far-reaching consequences of its reversal. Washington must now manage the fallout of a sudden, historic fiscal realignment. The Supreme Court's decision has upended major trade deals negotiated under the threat of tariffs. Agreements with the European Union and Japan, secured by leveraging IEEPA tariffs, are now in jeopardy as partners reconsider their commitments. The EU may seek to renegotiate or abandon a pact involving hundreds of billions in investments and energy purchases. Japan's $550 billion investment deal faces similar uncertainty, with both sides questioning the original incentives. The loss of tariff leverage weakens the administration's negotiating position and risks unraveling key foreign policy achievements. The turmoil highlights the instability of deals made under legal threat rather than mutual agreement. America's global trade relationships now enter a period of uncertainty and realignment. The Supreme Court's ruling has split the nation. Business groups and importers celebrate the end of unpredictable tariffs and the promise of refunds, seeing it as a victory for the rule of law. The White House and its allies, however, denounce the decision as judicial overreach that weakens America's ability to protect its industries. Labor unions and manufacturing groups fear exposure to foreign competition without tariff protection. Legal experts praise the ruling as a necessary reassertion of congressional power over trade. Internationally, leaders hope for a return to stable, rules-based trade, but uncertainty remains over the fate of existing deals and future U.S. strategy. The Supreme Court's decision is a defining moment for presidential power in the modern era. It sets a precedent that even in times of global uncertainty, executive authority has limits, especially in areas reserved for Congress. Future presidents must now seek congressional approval for broad tariff actions, ensuring greater debate and accountability. The ruling strengthens the judiciary's role as an independent check on the executive branch. It signals a return to traditional, deliberative trade policy and curbs the use of emergency powers for economic policymaking. The decision's legacy will be felt in law, politics, and international relations for years to come. As America moves forward, the boundaries of executive power have been redrawn, shaping the nation's future at home and abroad.